They laughed when he dropped to his knees to scrub their boots. They mocked him when he cleaned up their deliberate messes. They called him the invisible old man, who didn't deserve their respect. But when a 4-star general walked past, every decorated officer in that room snapped to attention and saluted the janitor with trembling reverence, calling him Commander. Everything they thought they knew about power shattered in an instant. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The first light of dawn hadn't yet touched the Virginia hills when Elias Roarke pushed through the service entrance of Westbridge Military Academy. His cart, rattled one wheel, had been loose for 3 weeks now, singing that familiar off-key squeak with every rotation. He didn't bother reporting it anymore. Maintenance had a hierarchy of priorities, and an old janitor's equipment didn't rank. The hallways stretched before him in that particular silence that belongs only to institutions in the hours before they wake. Marble floors gleamed under emergency lighting. Along the walls, banners hung with words cadets recited, but rarely embodied discipline, honor, duty. Elias had seen those words on different walls in different languages, in places where they meant the difference between coming home and being carried home. But here they were decoration. He was 71 years old. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, gripped the mop handle with the same precision they'd once held other instruments: a rifle, a radio, a wounded soldier's stretcher. His back protested the early hour, but he'd learned long ago that pain was just information. You acknowledged it and moved forward. The uniform he wore now was gray coveralls with Westbridge Maintenance embroidered across the back. The name tag read simply, Elias. No last name, no rank, no history. Just a first name for an invisible man. He started his rounds on the 2nd floor, West Wing, the dormitories where 237 cadets slept in various states of dreams and ambition. Some dreamed of commanding battalions. Others dreamed of medals and ceremony. A very few, dreamed of actually serving something larger than themselves. Elias knew the difference. He'd commanded enough young soldiers to recognize hunger versus purpose, ego versus calling. The bathroom outside room 214 needed attention. Someone, probably multiple someones, had engaged in what the academy politely termed high spirits. Toilet paper festooned the stalls like defeated surrender flags. Soap scum formed abstract patterns on mirrors. The floor suggested that respect for custodial staff ranked somewhere below respect for fire ants. He'd seen this room pristine yesterday evening. This was 6 hours of deliberate contempt. Elias said nothing. He never said anything. He pulled on latex gloves, filled his bucket, and began the systematic process of restoration. Soap to mirror, cleaner to porcelain, mop to floor. Each action performed with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to mission planning. Every mission had objectives. This one's objective was dignity, the space's dignity, if not his own. Jesus, he's actually doing it. The voice came from the doorway. Elias didn't turn around. He recognized the speaker, without-looking Cadet Landon Pierce, 19 years old, son of Senator Margaret Pierce, grandson of Ambassador Theodore Pierce, inheritor of a legacy that had apparently forgotten to include basic human decency in its genetic package. Dude, I literally pissed on that floor 4 hours ago. Another voice, Cadet Marcus Webb Landon's constant shadow. Think he knows? Who cares? He's a janitor. It's his job. Laughter. The particular brand of laughter that comes from people who've never had to clean up their own messes, literal or metaphorical. Elias kept mopping. The water swirled gray and grimy. He'd cleaned worse. Much worse. Sand and blood didn't come out of transport vehicles easily. You needed specific solvents, patience, and the ability to compartmentalize what those stains represented. "Hey, old man," Landon's voice grew louder. "You missed a spot." A wadded paper towel landed 3 feet from Elias's mop. Deliberately. Performatively. "Landon, come on, man." A third voice, quieter. Cadet Jennifer Oakes, one of the few who sometimes said "good morning" when Elias passed. "What, I'm just helping him do his job." Landon's grin was audible. "He's here to serve, right? That's what service means." Elias bent down, picked up the paper towel, deposited it in his trash bag. His knees cracked like small arms fire. The sound made Marcus snort. He's gonna break a hip. "Nah, old guys are tough. My grandpa's like 80 and still plays golf. This guy looks like he fought in World War I." More laughter. Jennifer said something sharp that Elias couldn't quite hear, and footsteps retreated down the hallway. Silence returned. Elias finished the bathroom, checked his work with the thoroughness of a man for whom details meant survival, and moved his cart back into the hallway. The banners looked down at him. Discipline. Honor. Duty. He wondered not for the first time if the words had lost their weight through repetition. If saying them enough times in gleaming hallways had somehow leached out their meaning, left only the shells of syllables. He remembered learning those words differently. In heat that melted boot soles. In cold that turned breath to ice crystals. In situations where discipline meant controlling your fear enough to think honor meant staying when leaving was easier, and duty meant coming back for the wounded even when logic screamed to save yourself. But that was a long time ago. A different life, a different name, really, though the name had been the same. The man wearing it had been someone else. Commander Elias Roarke had died quietly, administratively in a hospital room at Walter Reed 17 years ago. The man who'd walked out was just Elias. No rank, no command, no particular reason for anyone to salute. He preferred it that way. Mostly. The main corridor stretched before him, 200 feet of polished marble, leading to the Academy's heart, the grand atrium, where portraits of distinguished alumni gazed down with expressions of stern accomplishment. Generals and admirals, colonels and captains, all frozen in their moment of peak achievement. Elias pushed his cart past them. The squeak of the broken wheel echoed like a metronome counting down something inevitable. The cafeteria opened at 0600. He had 45 minutes to clean the faculty lounge, empty trash from the administrative offices, and make himself scarce before the academy woke fully. Invisibility required timing. The faculty lounge smelled of old coffee and older ambitions. Instructors here were mostly veterans, men and women, who'd done their time in real theaters before accepting the relative peace of teaching the next generation. Some were good. They remembered what it meant to be young and certain and utterly unprepared for reality's curriculum. Others had forgotten, had let the comfort of routine and the deference of students convince them they were somehow superior to the struggle, rather than merely survivors of it. Elias emptied trash bins. Someone had left a half-eaten sandwich growing ambitious mold. Someone else had discarded a stack of ungraded papers with, "These kids don't even try anymore," scrawled across the top. He wondered if the instructor had tried lately, if teaching was still a calling, or had become just a job with decent benefits. Not his business. He was here to empty trash, not judge what people threw away. The administrative wing was quiet. Elias moved through offices with practiced efficiency, his presence so familiar that security cameras probably didn't even register him anymore. Just part of the furniture. Part of the infrastructure that kept the academy functioning while everyone focused on more important things. He paused outside the commandant's office. Through the frosted glass, he could see the outline of Colonel Patricia Hammond's desk, neat and organized, a reflection of a mind that believed order was the foundation of everything else. She wasn't wrong. Order mattered, but order without compassion became tyranny. He'd learned that the hard way. The trash bin here was nearly empty, a few crumpled memos, a protein bar wrapper. Colonel Hammond ran a tight ship. She'd been Air Force before transitioning to the academy 3 years ago. Elias had seen her service record once, accidentally, when she'd left a file folder on her desk during an evening cleaning. Distinguished Flying Cross. Bronze Star. Combat sorties over hostile territory. She knew. She'd been there. But knowledge and memory were different things. Knowledge you could file away, organize into lessons and curriculum. Memory lived in your bones, changed how you walked through the world. He moved on. By 05:45, Elias was finishing the last hallway, his cart now full of the day's first collection of waste, the physical evidence of 300 people living and learning and discarding. He headed toward the service elevator, the one cadets never used because it was slow, and opened near the maintenance wing. The elevator doors opened. 3 cadets stood inside, clearly having commandeered it, for reasons that probably violated 6 regulations. Landon Pierce, Marcus Webb, and a third Elias didn't recognize, a freshman, maybe eager to be included in whatever passed for social currency among the academy's elite. Oh, perfect. Landon's eyes lit up with the particular gleam of someone who'd just found new entertainment. Making room for the help, gentlemen. They didn't move. The elevator was plenty large enough for 4 people and a cart, but they spread out, took up space with the casual entitlement of those who'd never had to make themselves smaller. You can wait for the next one, old-timer. Marcus grinned. This one's full. The freshman looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. That was how it worked. Silence was complicity's favorite disguise. Elias met Marcus's eyes for just a moment, long enough to see the boy register something he didn't quite understand. A flicker of instinct that suggested maybe mocking this particular old man wasn't the power play he thought it was. But instinct lost to peer pressure. It usually did at 19. Yeah, the freshman added, his voice trying for confident and landing somewhere near desperate. Full. Sorry, man. The doors closed. Elias stood there, his cart between him and the closed elevator doors, and felt the familiar weight of invisibility. Not anger. He'd left anger behind years ago in places where it would have gotten good people killed. Just weariness. He took the stairs, 3 flights, cart bumping on each step, wheel squeaking its protest. By the time he reached the basement maintenance area, his back was screaming, and his knees felt like someone had replaced the cartilage with broken glass. He logged his cart into storage, hung up his gloves, and checked the schedule board. Tomorrow, cafeteria detail during lunch service. The shift every custodian dreaded because it meant cleaning while cadets ate, being present, while being invisible, navigating the minefield of trays and teenage territorial behavior. He signed his name. Just Elias. The supervisor had stopped asking for his last name years ago. Before leaving, he did what he did every morning, detoured through the Hall of Honor. This was the Academy's sacred space, a long gallery lined with photographs, plaques, and memorabilia from distinguished alumni and significant operations. Wars and peacekeeping missions, disasters, and rescues, the full spectrum of military service rendered in black and white and fading color. Most cadets rushed past, eager to get to class or breakfast. The history was just background noise to them set, dressing for their own future glory. But Elias stopped. Always at the same photograph. It was tucked in the corner, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Black and white, grainy, taken in harsh sunlight that had bleached out details. A young officer, maybe 30, saluted from the turret of a damaged vehicle. Behind him, smoke rose in thick columns. His uniform was filthy face, streaked with dust and exhaustion. But the salute was perfect, crisp, controlled. The small plaque beneath read, Operation Goliath 2003. Unit citation for extraordinary valor under fire. No names. No details. Just a moment frozen, removed from context. Elias stood there for 3 minutes like he did every morning. Remembering context. Remembering names. Remembering the weight of decisions made in smoke and chaos, the mathematics of choosing who might live and who definitely wouldn't if you chose wrong. 212 soldiers. That was the number he'd carried out of that situation. Not everyone. You never saved everyone. But 212 human beings who'd woken up that morning in hell and gone to sleep that night somewhere safer because of decisions made in seconds. The young officer in the photograph had made those decisions. Commander Elias Roarke had made those decisions. The janitor looking at the photograph had inherited the memory of making them. "You gonna stand there all day?" a voice behind him. Jerry Kowalski, the day shift supervisor, arriving early with coffee in hand. "Just looking." Elias turned away from the photograph. "You like that old war stuff, huh?" Something like that. "Bunch of ancient history, you ask me." Jerry sipped his coffee. "Kids today don't care. They're all about drones and cyber warfare. Boots on the ground is practically medieval to them." "Maybe. Anyway, heads up, there's some big symposium thing happening next week. Brass coming in, VIPs, the works. Commandant wants everything spotless. Might need extra hours." "I'll be here." "Yeah, you always are." Jerry studied him for a moment. "You got family, Elias? Someone waiting at home?" "No." "Huh." Jerry looked like he wanted to ask more, but didn't. People rarely did. Invisibility had its advantages. "Well, catch you tomorrow. Try to get some rest. Yeah, you look tired." "Always tired," Elias said, which was true. He left through the service entrance, emerging into full morning now sunlight beginning to warm the Virginia autumn. Cadets moved across the quad in formation, their synchronized steps a percussion of discipline and order. None of them looked at the old man leaving through the side door. He walked to the bus stop 3 blocks away. The academy was for them, not for staff parking, and waited on the bench someone had carved initials into decades ago. JP plus MR forever, inside a crooked heart. He wondered if JP and MR were still together, or if forever had lasted about as long as the bus bench's paint job. The number 7 bus arrived. The driver, Rosa, nodded at him. She was one of the few people who consistently saw him. "Morning, Mr. Elias." "Morning, Rosa." "Rough shift. Same as always." "Mm-hmm." She pulled into traffic. "You say that every day, but your eyes say different." He didn't respond. Rosa had learned not to push. His apartment was 12 minutes away in a complex that had been affordable housing 30 years ago and was now just housing you could afford if you didn't have other options. Second floor corner unit. The elevator worked about 60% of the time. Today it didn't. He took the stairs, his knees filing formal protests. Inside the apartment was exactly as he'd left it, which is to say exactly as it had been for the past 17 years. Minimalist not by design, but by disinterest. A couch someone had abandoned on the curb in 2011, a television that still required buttons to change channels, a kitchen table with one chair because he never had guests. On the wall, a single framed item, his honorable discharge certificate. Not displayed prominently, just hung in the bedroom where only he would see it. Proof that the life before this one had existed, even if sometimes it felt like someone else's story. He made instant coffee, the cheap kind that tasted like industrial runoff, but had caffeine, and sat at his table. Tomorrow he'd wake up at Euro 400, take the bus, push his squeaky cart through halls where teenagers with trust funds and last names that opened doors would walk past him without seeing. He'd clean their messes, absorb their mockery with the same quiet endurance he'd once applied to much worse conditions, and return to this apartment to sleep dreamless sleep. That was the rhythm. That was the life. It was fine. It was enough. It had to be. Because Commander Elias Roarke had died in a hospital room, and the man who'd survived him had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply continue. Show up. Do the work. Exist quietly in a world that no longer had a use for what you'd been. He finished his coffee, showered the Academy's day off his skin, and lay down in a bed that had molded to his shape through years of identical sleeps. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's television. A news anchor discussed a military operation somewhere distant, somewhere hot, somewhere young soldiers were learning the difference between training and truth. He hoped their commanders were good ones. Hoped they came home. Hoped someone would remember their names. Elias closed his eyes and found the sleep that had been waiting for him since dawn. Tomorrow the cart would squeak, the floor would need mopping, and the young people who didn't see him would continue not seeing him. Tomorrow would be exactly like today. Until it wasn't. The mockery started small, the way poison usually does, a drop here, a whisper there, building to something toxic through accumulation rather than intent. Or maybe intent was always there, just waiting for permission. Elias noticed it on Tuesday morning when he arrived for his shift. Someone had taped a piece of paper to his cart. The kind of effort that required premeditation someone had to stay up, create the thing, sneak down to the maintenance area, and affix it where he'd find it first thing. The paper was designed to look official, complete with the Westbridge Academy seal poorly photocopied at the top. Bold letters announced, Promotion Certificate, Senior Custodial Commander, First Class, Specializations, Advanced Mop Few Tactical Trash Deployment, Elite Floor Restoration, awarded for extraordinary service in the line of cleaning duty. Below that, a crude cartoon of a stick figure with a mop surrounded by stars and exaggerated military medals made from bottle caps glued to the paper. Elias read it once, carefully removed it, folded it into quarters, and placed it in his pocket. His face showed nothing. That was a skill you learned when survival depended on not broadcasting what you felt the enemy used your emotions as tactical data, and these kids, whether they knew it or not, were doing the same thing. He began his rounds. In the second-floor hallway, 3 cadets were gathered near the water fountain. They went silent when he approached, then erupted into barely suppressed laughter after he passed. He heard fragments, "Can't believe he just took it. Probably thinks it's real. Actually kept it." Marcus Webb's voice rose above the others. "Maybe we should get him a uniform. Little medals for most toilets cleaned and bravest response to cafeteria spills." Jennifer Oakes's voice cut through sharp. "You guys are assholes." "Oh, come on, Jenny. It's funny. Old guy probably hasn't gotten recognition in decades. We're doing him a favor." "Yeah, that's what you're doing. Definitely." Footsteps moved away. Elias kept mopping his back to the conversation, his hands steady on the handle. The routine was the same hallway to bathroom to stairwell to office. Physical labor that let the mind drift to other times, other places. He remembered a corporal couldn't recall the name. Now time had taken that who'd made jokes during the worst of it, dark humor in darker circumstances, the kind of laughter that kept sanity tethered when everything else suggested letting go. That corporal had understood what these cadets didn't comedy, was a tool, yes, but tools had purposes. You used humor to bond, to cope, to humanize horror. You didn't use it to diminish someone who couldn't push back without consequences. That corporal had saved 6 people by keeping them laughing when their minds wanted to shut down. He'd died doing it, took shrapnel that was meant for the soldier behind him, and his last words were a punchline Elias still remembered even if the name had faded. These kids didn't know the difference between humor and cruelty because they'd never needed to. That wasn't entirely their fault. Privilege was invisible to those who had it like water to fish, but it was still suffocating everyone else. By midweek, the certificate had apparently inspired others. Elias found a makeshift medal made from a crushed soda can attached to his cart with duct tape. The inscription written in permanent marker, "For extreme bravery in facing student messes." He removed it, said nothing. Thursday brought a hand-drawn promotion ceremony invitation posted on the maintenance room door. "You are cordially invited to celebrate Senior Custodial Commander Elias's elevation to Supreme Mop Marshal. Dress code, Janitor's Finest." Jerry found him staring at it during shift change. "Jesus." The supervisor's jaw tightened. "You know who's doing this? Doesn't matter." "The hell it doesn't. This is harassment, Elias. I can file a report, get Hammond involved." "And then what?" Elias turned to face him. "They get a talking to, maybe write an essay about respect, and I become the old janitor who can't take a joke. The target gets bigger, Jerry, not smaller. So you just take it. I've taken worse." Jerry studied him with an expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet day janitor. "Yeah," he said finally. "I guess you have." The instructors noticed too, though their responses varied. Major Chen, who taught tactical operations, found Elias cleaning the classroom after hours one evening and asked quietly if he was okay. Elias said he was fine, and Chen had nodded slowly, like he understood all the things that fine actually meant when someone used it that way. Lieutenant Morrison, on the other hand, had witnessed one of the incidents, a cadet deliberately kicking over Elias's bucket in the hallway, and had simply kept walking, his discomfort visible in the quickening of his pace, but his intervention non-existent. That was the problem with institutional cultures. They ran on complicity as much as compliance. Everyone knew, everyone saw. But seeing without acting was just witnessing, and witnesses weren't the same as allies. Friday brought the week's crescendo. Elias was assigned cafeteria duty during lunch service, which meant navigating 400 cadets eating simultaneously in a space designed to showcase the Academy's grandeur, but not its empathy. The cafeteria was all soaring ceilings and natural light long tables arranged in precise rows where cadets sat according to year and social hierarchy. He pushed his cart to the staging area near the kitchen, began his work routine, wiping tables immediately after groups finished emptying trash bins before they overflowed, maintaining the careful invisibility that the job required. Landon Pierce sat at a table near the center, surrounded by his usual constellation of admirers and enablers. He was holding court about something, gesturing expansively with a fork playing to his audience. Elias was cleaning a table 2 rows away when he heard his name, or rather heard someone say, "The Janitor," in a voice loud enough to carry. "I'm telling you, we should actually throw him a ceremony." Landon's voice had that particular quality of someone who thought volume equaled wit. "Get him up on the stage during assembly. Make it official. For services rendered to the Westbridge Academy Sanitation Division." Dude Hammond would shut that down so fast. Marcus shook his head. "Not if we framed it right. Honoring our support staff or some bullshit. Make it look like we're being respectful." A female cadet, Sarah Chen Elias, thought, though he wasn't certain, leaned forward. "Or, and hear me out, you could just leave the old man alone." "Why we're not hurting him? He probably loves the attention. When's the last time anyone even looked at him? Every time you make him clean up your deliberate messes?" Sarah's voice had an edge. "That kind of looking, that's his job, Chen. We're giving him job security." Elias continued wiping tables. The conversation wasn't new, he'd heard variations of it his entire tenure at Westbridge. The specifics changed, but the melody remained constant justification, rationalization, the mental gymnastics required to feel good about bad behavior. He'd seen it in commanders too sometimes. Officers who convinced themselves that brutality was strength, that cruelty to subordinates was leadership, that respect flowed from fear rather than trust. Those commanders got people killed. Not always themselves, they usually survived, but the people under them paid the price for ego masquerading as authority. "Incoming," someone at Landon's table muttered. Elias registered the warning half a second before it mattered. He turned just as Landon stood tray in hand and executed what was clearly a practiced accident. The tray tilted fell-scent plates and food and beverages cascading in a perfect arc that terminated at Elias's feet. Spaghetti and meat sauce, chocolate milk, a dinner roll that bounced twice before settling in the pooling liquid. The cafeteria didn't go silent, movies had lied about that, but there was a definite dip in ambient noise, a collective intake of breath as 400 people registered the moment and decided simultaneously whether to react or pretend they hadn't noticed. Most chose pretend. "Oh man, I'm so sorry." Landon's voice dripped with false contrition. "I'm such a klutz today. Here, let me—" He made a show of reaching for napkins, half-heartedly dabbing at the mess, clearly performing concern rather than feeling it. Elias looked at him. Really looked. Not with anger or resentment, but with the detached assessment he'd once used to evaluate soldiers under stress. What he saw was a 19-year-old boy who'd been told his whole life that his last name was Armor, that consequences were for other people, that the world would bend to accommodate him because it always had. What he saw was someone who'd never been tested. Not really. Never faced a moment where his choices meant someone else's survival. What he saw was someone who might become a decent officer one day if life ever forced him to grow past this moment, or might become the kind of leader who got good people killed because he'd never learned the difference between rank and respect. "It's fine," Elias said quietly. "I've got it." He bent down, knees protesting, back aching, and began cleaning. The mop came out, the bucket filled with sudsy water. The routine that had become muscle memory took over. Landon stood there for a moment, perhaps expecting more reaction, then shrugged and returned to his table to quiet laughter and congratulatory shoulder punches. Sarah Chen appeared beside Elias with a handful of napkins. She didn't say anything, just knelt down and started helping her movements quick and efficient. "You don't have to," Elias told her. "I know." She kept working. They cleaned in silence. When it was done, Sarah stood, met his eyes briefly, and in that moment he saw recognition. Not of who he'd been, but of what this was. She saw it. She understood. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and walked away. Elias finished his shift, logged out, took the bus home to his apartment where the elevator still didn't work, and the walls still transmitted his neighbor's television preferences. That night he didn't look at his discharge certificate on the wall. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with instant coffee going cold in front of him and the fake promotion certificate unfolded beside his cup. "Advanced Mop Foo," he read aloud to the empty room. "Tactical trash deployment." He should have thrown it away. It was garbage designed to make him feel like garbage. But he'd kept it. Not because it was funny, or because he was somehow grateful for the attention, but because it was evidence, documentation. Proof that this was happening, that he wasn't imagining the erosion of dignity that came with being dismissed by people who thought dismissal was harmless. In another life, he would have filed a report, would have used official channels to address official wrongs. But Commander Roarke was dead, and Elias the janitor had no channels, no leverage, no last name that opened doors or commanded attention. He was just an old man with a mop cart, and memories that sometimes felt more real than the present. The coffee went cold. The night got late. Eventually he slept. The pattern continued through the following week. Small cruelties compounding. A "Reserved for Senior Custodial Commander" sign taped to a mop closet. Whispered laughter as he passed. The sense that he'd become entertainment, a character in someone else's story, rather than a person in his own life. Jerry pulled him aside on Wednesday. "Hammond's calling a faculty meeting about respect and conduct," the supervisor said. "Apparently some instructors complained about how support staff are being treated." "That'll fix everything," Elias said without inflection. "Hey, it's something. Better than nothing." "Is it?" Jerry didn't have an answer for that. The meeting happened Thursday afternoon. Elias wasn't included, support staff rarely were, but he heard about it through the maintenance gossip network. Colonel Hammond had apparently given a stern speech about Westbridge values and treating all personnel with dignity. She'd referenced the Academy's honor code. She'd reminded instructors of their responsibility to model behavior. She hadn't named specific incidents, hadn't identified perpetrators, hadn't outlined consequences, which meant she'd done what institutions always did, acknowledged the problem in abstract terms while avoiding concrete action that might actually change anything. Elias continued his shifts. The mockery didn't stop, but it went quieter, more subtle. The overt ceremonies ceased, but the underlying dismissal remained. He was still invisible, when convenient still an object of amusement, when boredom required entertainment. But something was shifting in the Academy's atmosphere, though Elias didn't recognize it at first. There were more closed-door meetings, more whispered conversations among senior staff. An energy in the administrative wing that suggested something was being planned. He learned what it was on a Friday morning when he was cleaning the commandant's office and overheard Hammond on a phone call. "Yes, sir, we'd be honored to host. Of course, General Denning. The annual leadership symposium is exactly the right venue. Yes, sir, the cadets will benefit tremendously from your experience." Elias's hands stopped moving. The mop handle went still in his grip. General Marcus Denning. That was a name he knew, a name connected to smoke and chaos and decisions made when death was the default and survival required miracles. He forced himself to continue cleaning to maintain the invisible routine, but his mind was suddenly elsewhere. Else when? 22 years ago. Desert heat that made thinking difficult and breathing painful. An ambush that turned routine patrol into massacre. 212 soldiers trapped, surrounded ammunition running low communications cut hope becoming theoretical. and a young lieutenant named Marcus Denning, 26 years old, taking shrapnel in 3 places but refusing evacuation until every soldier under his command was accounted for. Elias Commander Roarke then had carried that lieutenant to the extraction point personally, had held pressure on wounds while calling in air support with his other hand, had promised Marcus Denning that he'd make it home, and had moved heaven and hell to make that promise real. The lieutenant had survived, had thrived, had become the kind of officer the military built legends around: strategic brilliance combined with genuine care for the people under his command. The kind of leader Elias had always tried to be. And now General Denning was coming to Westbridge. Elias finished cleaning Hammond's office, returned his cart to storage, and stood in the maintenance room for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of coincidence that probably wasn't coincidence at all. The universe had a sense of irony, or justice, or maybe just timing. He pulled the crumpled promotion certificate from his locker where he'd stored it, looked at the crude drawings and mocking words, thought about the boy who'd created it, and all the other boys and girls who'd participated in making an old janitor their entertainment. They didn't know, couldn't know. He'd made certain of that by choosing invisibility over recognition service over status. But General Marcus Denning would know, and in 3 weeks during the leadership symposium in front of the entire academy, that knowledge would collide with ignorance in ways no one was prepared for. Elias refolded the certificate, placed it back in his locker, and headed home. That night, for the first time in months, he didn't sleep dreamlessly. He dreamed of sand and smoke, of young faces trusting him to bring them home, of decisions that lived in his bones, even when his mind tried to file them away as history. He dreamed of being Commander Roarke again just for a moment, and woke up as Elias the janitor in an apartment with an broken elevator and thin walls with a shift starting in 4 hours and a squeaky cart waiting for him at the academy. The routine continued. The mockery persisted in its quieter form. The cadets walked past him without seeing, and the instructors saw without acting, and the institution proclaimed values it didn't enforce. But something was coming, something inevitable, something that would shatter every assumption they'd built about who mattered and who didn't, about what strength looked like and what leadership meant. 3 weeks felt like forever, and no time at all. The 3 weeks collapsed into days, then hours, then the particular kind of morning where everything ordinary was about to become extraordinary, and nobody knew it yet, except the man pushing a mop cart through pre-dawn silence. Elias arrived at Oro 4:30 on symposium day. Earlier than usual, though, his shift didn't officially start until 0500. He told himself it was to get ahead of the extra work the academy had been in preparation mode for days, every surface polished to mirror brightness, every corner inspected for dust that might embarrass the institution in front of visiting dignitaries. But that was a lie, he told himself, with the same discipline he'd once used to tell soldiers that everything would be fine, when fine was a fantasy. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He didn't know what today would bring, but he knew it would bring something, and being early meant being prepared, and preparation was the only variable you could control when chaos was inevitable. The grand atrium had been transformed. Rows of chairs faced a temporary stage where the commandant's podium stood flanked by flags United States Virginia and Westbridge Academy, each pressed and hung with ceremonial precision. Banners declaring "Leadership through Service" had been mounted on the walls. The whole space hummed with the kind of expectant energy that preceded important events. Elias cleaned around the edges, careful not to disturb the setup. His cart's squeaky wheel echoed in the empty space, a metronome counting down to something. By 600, other staff arrived. caterers wheeling in coffee urns and pastry tables, AV technicians checking microphone levels and projection systems. Jerry appeared with a clipboard and the harried expression of someone whose job suddenly mattered to people who usually didn't care about maintenance. "You good?" Jerry asked, stopping beside Elias. "Always." "Right." Jerry consulted his clipboard. "Okay, so doors open at 0800, ceremony starts at 0900. Hammond wants all custodial staff out of sight by 0845. We're supposed to be invisible today." "Understood." "You sure you're okay? You seem—" Jerry searched for the word. "Different. Just tired." It wasn't entirely a lie. Elias had slept poorly, his mind cycling through scenarios and memories past and present tangling in ways that made rest impossible. He'd stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 0330, staring at a 71-year-old face that sometimes still expected to see the 30-year-old commander looking back. He'd considered shaving differently. Wearing his old cap, the one with the faded unit patch he'd kept in the back of his closet. Some small signal that today was different, but in the end, he'd dressed exactly as always, gray coveralls, work boots worn smooth at the heel, the generic Elias name tag. The uniform of invisibility. Because what was about to happen needed to happen exactly as it was. No preparation, no warning, just truth colliding with assumption in the most public way possible. The academy woke around him in stages. Cadets in dress uniforms began filtering into the atrium by 0730, their excitement and nervousness palpable. This was the kind of event that mattered for their careers, being seen by a 4-star general, making impressions that might become recommendations that might become opportunities. Landon Pierce arrived with his usual entourage, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing that particular combination of confidence and entitlement that came from never doubting you belonged in any room you entered. He walked past Elias without seeing him. They all did. Elias had positioned himself near the hallway that connected to the maintenance wing, visible if you looked, invisible if you didn't. He had a mop in hand, ostensibly spot cleaning a floor that didn't need cleaning, but really just being present for what came next. Colonel Hammond appeared at 0815, her own uniform sharp enough to cut glass. She scanned the atrium with the critical eye of someone for whom details were destiny, nodded once in satisfaction, and moved to greet the arriving faculty and staff. The VIPs began arriving at 0830. Elias recognized some from their photos in military publications. A 2-star admiral from Norfolk, a brigadier general from the Pentagon, a colonel who'd made national news for his work in humanitarian operations. They were all impressive in the way that high rank was always impressive, all polished bearing and confident handshakes. But they weren't who everyone was waiting for. At 0855, a black SUV pulled up to the main entrance. Elias couldn't see it from his position, but he felt the ripple of attention, the way the entire atrium seemed to inhale and hold its breath. General Marcus Denning had arrived. The main doors opened. Colonel Hammond moved forward, her salute crisp. And then he entered. 22 years had changed him, but not as much as they'd changed Elias. Denning was 58 now, his hair mostly gray, his face lined with the kind of weathering that came from decades of hard decisions in hard places. 4 stars on his shoulders, ribbons on his chest that told stories of valor and service and sacrifice. But his eyes, those were the same. Sharp and assessing the eyes of someone who'd seen too much to ever take anything at face value. The atrium erupted in movement. Every cadet, every instructor, every person in uniform snapped to attention and saluted. The sound of 400 hands hitting 400 chests in synchronized precision was like thunder indoors. Denning returned the salute with practiced ease, then moved into the room, Hammond at his side, other VIPs falling into formation behind him. Elias watched from his peripheral position. He'd set down his mop, but remained where he was, hands at his sides, breathing steady, despite the fact that his heart was suddenly operating on combat time, that accelerated rhythm that came when situations moved from theoretical to real. Denning was speaking quietly with Hammond, nodding at something she said. They were moving toward the stage, following the planned route that would take them past rows of attentive cadets and up to the podium where Denning would deliver whatever wisdom he'd prepared for this audience. That was how it was supposed to go. That was the script. But then Denning stopped walking. He'd passed the first row of cadets, was maybe 20 feet from the stage, when his head turned slightly, like he'd heard something, or sensed something, or simply felt that particular tingle of instinct that kept soldiers alive when logic said they should be dead. His eyes swept the room, passed over cadets and instructors, moved to the periphery, found Elias standing in the maintenance hallway with a mop cart and gray coveralls and 71 years of living quietly, and stopped. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The atrium held its collective breath without knowing why. Hammond looked confused. The other VIPs glanced at each other uncertainly, but Elias and Denning were suddenly the only two people in the room separated by 20 years and 50 feet and entirely different lives, but connected by something that didn't care about distance or time or the accumulated weight of everything that had happened since a young lieutenant had taken shrapnel and an older commander had promised he'd make it home. Denning's expression did something complicated, shock and recognition, and something that might have been the closest thing to tears a 4-star general allowed himself in public. Then he turned fully away from the stage, away from Hammond and the VIPs and the entire carefully orchestrated ceremony, and walked directly toward Elias. The crowd's confusion was audible. Murmurs rippled through rows of cadets. Hammond actually said, "General," in a voice pitched between concern and bewilderment. Denning ignored all of it. He walked past the last row of chairs, past the perimeter of the official ceremony space, into the hallway where maintenance workers were supposed to be invisible. He stopped 3 feet from Elias and saluted. Not the casual return salute he'd given the atrium full of officers and cadets. This was different. This was a salute given with every ounce of respect and recognition and gratitude that a human being could compress into a single gesture. His spine was steel, his hand was perfectly positioned, his eyes never left Elias's face. "Sir," Denning said, his voice rough with emotion, but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent space. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person." Elias stood frozen for half a heartbeat. Every instinct said to deflect, to dismiss, to maintain the invisibility that had protected him for 17 years. But you didn't leave a fellow soldier's salute unreturned. Slowly, with the muscle memory that never really faded, no matter how long you pretended to forget, Elias brought his hand up in a salute that was somehow both rusty and perfect. The mechanics were exact, he'd done it 10,000 times in another life, but the meaning behind it carried every year between then and now. "General," he said quietly, "just that, just acknowledgement." They held the salute for 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. Then Denning lowered his hand, and Elias followed. The atrium was absolutely silent now. 400 people collectively trying to understand what they were witnessing. Colonel Hammond had gone pale. The other VIPs looked stunned. And the cadets, especially the cadets in the front rows, were staring with expressions that suggested their understanding of the universe had just developed significant cracks. Landon Pierce's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching horror as realization slowly percolated through his assumption-laden worldview. Denning stepped forward, extended his hand. Elias took it. The handshake was firm, prolonged, the kind of physical contact that communicated things words couldn't. "I've been looking for you for 20 years," Denning said, his voice still carrying in the silence. "They told me you'd retired, disappeared. I tried to find you when I made General, wanted to thank you properly, but you'd vanished." "I'm not hard to find," Elias said. "I've been here for 12 years. Here." Denning looked around the hallway at the mop cart, at the gray coveralls, at the absolute absence of anything that suggested the man in front of him had once commanded operations that saved hundreds of lives. "Here." It wasn't a question, but Elias answered anyway. "It's honest work." Denning's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to say something about how cleaning floors wasn't worthy of a man who'd earned every medal the military had to give, but he was smart enough and had lived enough to know that telling someone their choices were wrong rarely went well. Instead, he turned to face the atrium full of people who were still processing what was happening. Hammond had moved closer, her confusion now mixed with growing concern that she'd somehow missed something catastrophically important. "Colonel," Denning addressed her formally, "I need to brief everyone on something. May I use your podium?" "Of course, sir." Hammond's military training overrode her bewilderment. "Whatever you need." Denning looked back at Elias. "Will you join me up there? I don't think... That wasn't really a request, Commander." The title hit like ordnance. Commander, spoken aloud, in front of everyone. Elias wanted to refuse, wanted to remain in the hallway where he belonged, where he'd chosen to belong, where life was simpler because expectations were minimal. But Denning was looking at him with an expression that said some debts didn't expire, some stories needed telling, and some invisibility was actually injustice disguised as humility. "All right," Elias heard himself say. They walked together toward the stage. Every eye in the atrium tracked their movement. The other VIPs parted like water, their confusion obvious, but their discipline preventing questions. Denning climbed the 3 steps to the stage. Elias followed, feeling his knees protest, feeling his back remind him that he was 71, and stages were for younger people. Hammond adjusted the microphone, stepped back. Denning stood at the podium, Elias slightly behind and to the side, and looked out at 400 faces staring back with rapt attention. "I had a speech prepared," Denning began. "Spent 2 weeks on it. Anecdotes about leadership lessons from the field, the kind of wisdom you're supposed to impart at these things." He paused. "But I'm going to tell you a different story instead. One you need to hear." The atrium somehow got quieter. 22 years ago, I was a lieutenant leading a patrol in a theater I can't name for an operation that's still partially classified. What I can tell you is that we got hit. Ambushed. Bad intel, worse luck, and suddenly 212 soldiers were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of time. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of memory. We were going to die. All of us. That was the math. That was the reality. He looked back at Elias, who stood still, his face impassive, his hands at his sides. But we had a commander. Not our unit commander, he'd been killed in the initial assault. No, we had the ranking officer in the AO who'd been coordinating operations from a relatively safe position 5 clicks away. When he heard we were trapped, he did something that every tactical manual said was insane. He left his protected position, took a skeleton crew, and drove directly into the ambush zone. Denning's voice grew stronger. He coordinated extraction under fire, called in air support while physically carrying wounded soldiers to evacuation points, made decisions in seconds that I've spent 20 years analyzing and still can't improve on. He stayed until every single soldier who could be saved was out. 212 people came home from a situation where the projected casualty rate was 90%. We came home because one man decided that acceptable losses were unacceptable. Complete silence. Even breathing seemed suspended. That commander was awarded medals he never wore, given commendations he never displayed, offered promotions he eventually refused, and when he retired, he disappeared so thoroughly that the military lost track of one of its most decorated officers. Denning's voice carried something between anger and sadness. I've been trying to find him for 2 decades, to thank him, to tell him that everything I've accomplished, every soldier I've led, every decision I've made, it's all possible because he made sure I survived to do it. He turned fully to Elias now. You know him as a custodian. You've watched him clean your messes for 12 years. Some of you have mocked him, made jokes, treated him as invisible because his current uniform doesn't command your respect. Landon Pierce had gone white. Several cadets around him looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. But I know him as Commander Elias Roarke, my commanding officer, my hero, the man who taught me that leadership isn't about the uniform you wear, it's about the decisions you make when everything's on the line, and there's no good option, only less bad ones. Denning's voice broke slightly on the next words. Sir, would you please join me at the podium? Elias didn't want to. Every fiber of his being wanted to retreat back to the maintenance hallway, back to invisibility, back to the life where he didn't have to be Commander Roarke with all the weight that title carried. But some orders you followed even when they weren't really orders. He stepped forward, stood beside Denning, looked out at an atrium full of young faces staring at him with shock and shame and dawning understanding. The microphone was suddenly in front of him. Denning had stepped slightly back, giving him the floor. Elias looked at the microphone for a long moment, then at the faces, then at Landon Pierce, sitting rigid in the 3rd row, his cocky confidence completely demolished. I don't have a speech prepared, Elias said finally, his voice quiet but carrying. I'm not good at speeches anymore. Haven't been for a long time. He paused, gathering thoughts that had been filed away for years. General Denning is being generous about what happened 22 years ago. The truth is messier. We lost 38 soldiers that day. 38 people who trusted me to bring them home and didn't make it. I remember every name, every face, every decision I made that maybe could have been different, could have saved one more. His hands gripped the podium. So when people thank me for saving 212, I hear them. But I also hear the 38 who aren't here to be counted. That's what command means. It means living with mathematics that no human should have to calculate. The atrium remained frozen. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because you need to understand something about leadership that no textbook teaches. He looked directly at Landon now. Strength without humility fails. Authority without respect corrodes. Power without compassion destroys. You can have perfect tactics and flawless strategy, but if you don't see the humanity in everyone, especially those you think are beneath you, you'll be the kind of leader who gets good people killed. His voice grew firmer. You walk past me every day and don't see me. That's human nature. We categorize people by their uniforms, their job titles, their visible ranks. But everyone has a story you don't know. Everyone has carried weight you haven't seen. And treating someone as less than because their current chapter looks different from yours isn't just disrespectful. It's dangerous. Because one day, you'll be the one who needs grace, who needs someone to see past your current circumstance to your inherent worth. He released the podium. I chose this work, chose invisibility, and it's taught me more about character than my years in command. Because how you treat people when there's no benefit to treating them well, that's who you really are. That's the leader you'll become. Silence held for 5 heartbeats. Then from the back row a cadet stood. then another. Then suddenly the entire atrium was standing, but not in applause, in salute. 400 hands rose in synchronized acknowledgement, but this time the gesture carried weight it hadn't before. Elias stood there, an old man in coveralls on a stage he'd never wanted, and slowly returned the salute to an atrium full of people who were finally truly seeing him. The salute held for what felt like an eternity, compressed into seconds. 400 hands remained raised, 400 pairs of eyes locked on the old man in coveralls who'd just redefined everything they thought they understood about worth and respect and what it meant to truly serve. Elias lowered his hand first. The gesture released everyone else, and the sound of 400 arms dropping simultaneously was like a wind passing through the atrium. But nobody sat down. They remained standing, trapped in that peculiar space between revelation and response. Knowing something profound had shifted, but not yet understanding how to navigate the new terrain. General Denning stepped forward, placed a hand briefly on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes, then addressed the room again. "I'm going to deviate from the planned program," he said. "Commander Roarke and I need to speak privately. Colonel Hammond, I trust you can facilitate a brief recess." Hammond, who'd been standing off to the side, looking like someone who'd just watched their carefully organized world get detonated, snapped back into professional mode. "Of course, sir. Cadets at ease. 15-minute recess. Remain in the atrium." The spell broke. Movement returned, but it was subdued, uncertain. Cadets sat down, slowly began whispering to each other, their voices creating a low hum of processing and reckoning. Denning guided Elias off the stage, Hammond trailing behind. They moved toward a side conference room, the one normally reserved for visiting dignitaries and important meetings. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. He'd cleaned that room 100 times, always careful not to disturb the important papers left on its important table by important people. Now, he was walking in through the front door instead of entering through the service entrance. The room was exactly as he remembered. Long mahogany table leather chairs, a portrait of the Academy's founder looking stern and judgmental on the wall. Hammond closed the door behind them, cutting off the murmur from the atrium. "Sir," Hammond began, then stopped, clearly unsure how to proceed. She looked at Elias like she was seeing a ghost. "Commander Roarke, I had no idea. Your employment file just said that I'm a janitor named Elias," he finished quietly. "That's accurate. But your service record, your rank, your—" She struggled for words. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why would you work here as custodial staff when you could—" "When I could, what, Colonel?" Elias's voice was gentle but firm. "Trade on old glory. Demand respect. I hadn't earned in this context. I retired from the military. Completely. What I did before doesn't entitle me to anything now except the memories and those I carry, whether anyone knows about them or not." Denning was watching this exchange with an expression that mixed understanding and frustration. "With respect, Commander, that's noble bullshit. You earned more than memories. You earned recognition. And instead, you've been—" He gestured vaguely, anger creeping into his voice. "You've been cleaning up after kids who've mocked you for years." "Yes," Elias agreed simply. "That doesn't make you angry." "Sometimes. But anger without purpose is just noise." Elias sat down in one of the leather chairs, his body grateful for the support. "General, you know as well as I do that the military teaches you to measure respect in rank and ribbons. That's functional when everyone's in uniform, but civilian life doesn't work that way. Here, a janitor is a janitor, regardless of what he did before. And honestly, that's how it should be. Respect based on current contribution, not past credentials." Except they didn't respect your current contribution either, Hammond interjected, her voice tight. If even half of what I'm inferring is true, our cadets have been harassing you, creating a hostile work environment. And the faculty. She closed her eyes briefly. We saw it and did nothing. Some of you did nothing, Elias corrected. A few tried. One cadet helped me clean up a deliberate mess. That's not nothing. Denning sat across from him, leaned forward. Commander, I need you to understand something. What happened to you here that's not just unfortunate. It's dangerous. These kids are going to become officers. They're going to command real soldiers in real situations. And if they can't see the humanity in a janitor, how the hell are they going to value the lives of the people under their command? That's exactly why I spoke, Elias said. Not for me. For whoever they'll lead next. The room fell quiet. Hammond paced to the window, stared out at the quad, where cadets in previous generations had walked, probably carrying the same assumptions as the current crop. This is systemic, she said finally. It's not just a few bad cadets. It's a culture that's allowed contempt to masquerade as hierarchy. We've taught them discipline and tactics and strategy, but somehow we've failed to teach them basic human decency. Not somehow, Denning said. We've failed because we've made respect conditional. We've tied it to rank instead of humanity. Hell, I've done it myself. How many enlisted soldiers have I walked past without really seeing them? How many support staff have I treated as furniture? He looked at Elias. You just gave me a masterclass in leadership, and the lesson is one I should have learned decades ago. Elias shook his head. The lesson isn't new, General. It's ancient. We just keep forgetting it, because remembering is harder than reverting to convenient hierarchies. Hammond turned from the window. We need to address this, immediately. Not with a speech or a policy memo, but with real structural change. Agreed, Denning said. But it needs to come from you, Colonel. I'm here today and gone tomorrow. You're the one who sets the culture. Hammond's expression hardened with determination. Then we set a new culture, starting now. They talked for another 10 minutes, sketching out frameworks and commitments, the General providing strategic insight, while Hammond translated it into institutional action. Elias mostly listened occasionally, offering perspective when asked, but primarily watching two competent leaders recognize a failure and choose to address it rather than excuse it. Eventually, Hammond checked her watch. We should return to the atrium. The cadets need to hear from both of you. Elias stood his body, reminding him that he was still 71, regardless of what revelations had occurred. What exactly do they need to hear? The truth, Hammond said simply. That we failed them by allowing this culture, and that we're changing it. They returned to find the atrium in subdued conversation. But the moment the door opened, silence reasserted itself. Everyone stood, not at attention this time, but in respect that felt less automatic and more chosen. Denning and Elias returned to the stage. Hammond joined them, standing at the podium with the bearing of someone about to make a difficult but necessary statement. Be seated, she instructed. The rustle of 400 people sitting was the only sound. Hammond gripped the podium, her knuckles white. I owe Commander Roarke an apology. A public one. Her voice carried the weight of command, but underneath it was something rawer shame. For 12 years, a decorated combat veteran has worked at this academy in a custodial capacity. And for 12 years, our institution has failed to see him, failed to respect him, failed to enforce the values we claim to hold sacred. She paused, looking out at the cadets. Some of you have actively mocked him, created cruel promotions and ceremonies designed to humiliate. Others witnessed this behavior and said nothing did nothing, allowed contempt to flourish through your silence. And the faculty, myself included, saw what was happening and made excuses. We told ourselves it was harmless, that support staff understood it was just jokes, that intervention would be awkward or difficult. Her voice grew harder. We were wrong. Harmless cruelty is still cruelty. Understanding doesn't equal accepting, and awkward conversations are the bare minimum price we should pay to maintain basic human dignity. Landon Pierce sat rigid in his seat, his face a mask of misery. Around him, other cadets wore similar expressions: shame, regret, the particular discomfort of having your worst behavior illuminated for public examination. This ends today, Hammond continued. Effective immediately, Westbridge Military Academy is implementing what we're calling the Roarke Standard. It's named for Commander Roarke, not to embarrass him, but to ensure we never forget what happens when we allow hierarchy to override humanity. She outlined the framework: mandatory bystander intervention training for all cadets and faculty, a formal reporting structure for harassment of any personnel regardless of rank or position, curriculum, changes to include servant leadership, and the ethics of respect, and perhaps most significantly, consequences with teeth. Not just stern talks, but actual disciplinary action, including dismissal for egregious violations. We're also implementing a restorative practice program, Hammond added. When harm occurs, and it will occur because we're all human, the response will include direct engagement between those who caused harm and those who experienced it. No more hiding behind institutional apologies. You'll face the people you've hurt and reckon with the impact of your choices. The atrium absorbed this in silence. These weren't suggestions or aspirational goals. This was policy structural change, the kind of institutional commitment that would outlast any individual's tenure. Hammond stepped back from the podium. General Denning has agreed to work with our curriculum committee to develop leadership modules around these principles, and Commander Roarke has graciously agreed to speak with small groups of cadets who wish to understand his experience and perspective. Elias blinked. That was news to him. He hadn't agreed to anything except coming back to the stage. But before he could object, Denning leaned over and whispered, "You don't get to drop that truth and then vanish again, Commander. These kids need to hear from you. Directly." Damn. The general had maneuvered him. Hammond continued. "But before any of that, I believe some of you have something to say." Silence stretched. Then from the third row, Landon Pierce stood. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. For a long moment he just stood there, clearly warring with himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Commander Roarke, He stopped, swallowed hard. "There's no excuse for how I treated you. I can explain it boredom trying to impress people being an entitled asshole, but none of that makes it okay. I deliberately made your job harder. I mocked you. I created those fake promotions and ceremonies. I thought it was funny." His voice cracked. "It wasn't funny. It was cruel. And I'm sorry. That word doesn't fix anything, but it's all I have right now." He sat down abruptly, like his legs had given out. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Marcus Webb stood. "I participated in all of it. I'm sorry too." Then another cadet. Then another. They weren't making excuses or asking for forgiveness, just standing and acknowledging their actions and apologizing with the kind of raw honesty that only comes when comfortable delusions get shattered. Sarah Chen stood. "I didn't participate, but I didn't stop it either. I saw what was happening and told myself it wasn't my business. That silence made it worse. I'm sorry for that." More cadets stood. Some had been active participants. Others had been passive witnesses. All were reckoning with the same fundamental failure: they'd allowed someone's current circumstances to define their worth. And in doing so, they'd revealed everything about their own character deficits. When the standing finally stopped, Roughly a third of the atrium was on its feet. The other 2/3 sat in various states of discomfort, realizing that not having actively participated didn't mean they were innocent. Elias stood at the podium, looking at all these young faces, some crying, some stoic, all clearly grappling with revelations that formal education hadn't prepared them for. "Sit down," he said quietly. They sat. He took a breath. "Apologies are important. They're the first step. But they're also the easiest step because words cost nothing. The harder part comes next, changing behavior. Becoming different people than you were yesterday." He gripped the podium. "Some of you will do that. You'll take this shame and use it as fuel to become better officers, better leaders, better humans. You'll remember this moment when you're tempted to dismiss someone based on their rank or position or current circumstances. You'll intervene when you see others failing this test." His gaze swept the room. "But some of you won't. You'll feel bad today, and slightly bad tomorrow, and then the discomfort will fade and you'll revert to comfortable patterns. That's human nature. Change is hard. Sustained change is harder." He paused. "The question isn't whether you feel bad right now. The question is what you're willing to do differently going forward. That's what I'll be watching for. That's what your future soldiers will depend on." General Denning stood, then joined Elias at the podium. "The commander's right. This moment changes nothing unless you choose to let it change you. Leadership isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after the mistake becomes visible." He looked at Hammond. "Colonel, I'd like to propose something. Every incoming class at Westbridge should hear Commander Roarke's story. Not as punishment, but as foundation. Before they learn tactics and strategy, they should learn this: everyone has worth respect isn't conditional, and how you treat people when there's no benefit to treating them well defines who you really are." Hammond nodded. "Agreed. Commander Roarke, would you be willing to speak with each incoming class?" Elias wanted to say no, wanted to retreat back to invisibility and squeaky carts and the simple math of cleaning schedules. But he looked at Landon Pierce, still pale and shaken, and at Sarah Chen, who'd helped clean up a deliberate mess, and at the hundreds of other faces trying to process a lesson that might actually stick if he didn't abandon them now. "Yes," he heard himself say. "I'll do it." The rest of the symposium proceeded, but in a completely different atmosphere. Denning gave a modified version of his planned speech, weaving in themes of humility and service. Other speakers adjusted their remarks on the fly, suddenly aware that their audience had just received an education that made theoretical leadership principles concrete. During breaks, something unprecedented happened. Cadets approached Elias. Not with mockery or performative respect, but with genuine questions and careful apologies. He answered honestly, declining to make them feel better, but also declining to shame them further. The work was theirs to do. He could only point the direction. By late afternoon, when the symposium officially concluded, Elias was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. Emotional excavation was more draining than any cleaning shift. He was preparing to leave through the service entrance old habits when Jerry found him. "Hey," the supervisor said awkwardly. "So I guess I've been calling you by your first name for 12 years, when I should have been—" "Elias is fine," Elias interrupted. "Commander Roarke died a long time ago. I'm just Elias." "Yeah, but—" Jerry struggled. "You're also apparently a legitimate war hero who saved hundreds of lives, and I've been treating you like a janitor," Elias finished. "Which is what I am. This doesn't change that, Jerry. Tomorrow I'll still show up at 0500 with my squeaky cart and mop the same floors." Jerry stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely." "That's—" Jerry shook his head. "I don't know if that's the most humble thing I've ever heard, or the craziest." "Maybe both," Elias said. He headed for the door, then paused. "Jerry, thank you for treating me decently, even when you thought I was just a janitor. That mattered more than you know." He left before Jerry could respond, emerging into late afternoon sunshine that felt different somehow, like the same light hitting a changed world. The bus ride home was ordinary. Rosa drove traffic was moderate. The city passed outside windows that needed cleaning. But Elias felt the weight of the day settling into his bones, mixing with all the other weights he carried. That night, in his apartment with the broken elevator and thin walls, he stood in front of the framed discharge certificate on his bedroom wall. Commander Elias Roarke, honorably discharged. A document that had once defined him and then became just decoration in a space nobody else saw. Tomorrow, the Academy would start the hard work of cultural change. They'd implement policies and training and consequences. Some of it would stick, some would fade. That was how institutions worked momentum in both directions, progress and regression in constant tension. But for the first time in 12 years, Elias felt like maybe his presence at Westbridge meant something beyond clean floors. Maybe being seen, truly seen by people who needed to learn this particular lesson, was its own kind of service. He was still just a janitor. But maybe that was enough. The morning after the symposium, Elias woke at 0400 like always, his internal clock unbothered by the previous day's revelations. His body ached more than usual, standing on that stage, holding himself upright under the weight of 400 stairs had taken a toll his 71-year-old frame was now billing him for. He made his instant coffee, showered, dressed in the same gray coveralls, and caught the number 7 bus at the same time he always did. Rosa looked at him differently, though. "Saw you on the news last night," she said as he boarded. "Local station did a whole segment. War hero working as janitor teaching spoiled rich kids about respect." "They got half of it right," Elias said, taking his usual seat. "Which half?" "The janitor part." Rosa laughed, but it was gentle. "You're something else, Mr. Elias. Most people would be milking this for everything it's worth." "Most people didn't choose invisibility in the first place." The Academy looked the same when he arrived. Same architecture, same banners, same pre-dawn darkness. But something fundamental had shifted in the air, like how a forest feels different after a lightning strike, even before you see the scorched tree. Jerry was waiting for him in the maintenance area, coffee in hand, expression nervous. "So I talked to Hammond last night," Jerry began without preamble. "She wants to move you to a different position. Liaison or advisor or something with an actual office and—" "No," Elias said, logging in his cart. "You didn't even hear the full, 'Don't need to. I'm staying where I am.'" Jerry set down his coffee with more force than necessary. "Elias, for Christ's sake, you can't just keep mopping floors after what everyone learned yesterday. You're a decorated janitor," Elias interrupted firmly. "I'm a janitor who used to be something else. Moving me to an office doesn't change what I am now. It just makes everyone feel better about how they treated me before. Maybe that's important too. Maybe we need to feel accountable." "Accountability isn't comfort, Jerry. It's discomfort you sit with until you change." Elias checked his cart's supplies. "The best way for this place to reckon with what happened is for me to keep doing exactly what I've been doing. Except now everyone has to face who they dismissed every time they see me." Jerry opened his mouth closed. It opened it again. "That's either really wise or really stubborn." "Can't it be both?" The supervisor laughed despite himself. Yeah, I guess it can. Elias began his rounds. The hallways were empty at this hour, but he noticed something new. The photograph in the Hall of Honor, the one of the young officer saluting from the damaged vehicle, now had a proper plaque beside it. He stopped to read it. Commander Elias Roarke, Operation Goliath, 2003. 212 soldiers evacuated under fire. The quiet command leadership, without applause, service, without recognition, strength with humility. Elias stared at it for a long moment. The words were nice, well-intentioned, but they also felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who existed in black and white photographs, rather than in color with aching knees and a squeaky cart. He moved on. By 0600, cadets began filtering into common areas for morning routines. Elias was cleaning a bathroom on the second floor when 3 of them entered, not the usual boisterous energy, but subdued, careful. They saw him and froze. "Morning," Elias said neutrally, continuing to wipe down sinks. "Morning, sir," one of them replied automatically, then caught himself. "I mean morning, Commander. Or should we call you—" "Elias is fine." Awkward silence. The cadets used the facilities with unusual quietness, washed their hands with extra thoroughness, like performing normalcy required concentration. As they were leaving, one turned back. "My dad served under you. Lieutenant Morrison, well, he's a colonel now. He called me last night after seeing the news. He said you were the reason he survived his first deployment." Elias paused in his cleaning. Morrison. The name connected to a face young and terrified in a situation that should have killed him but didn't because of decisions made in smoke and chaos. "Your dad was a good soldier. I hope he's doing well." "He is. He said to tell you thank you if I ever got the chance." The cadet hesitated. "I'm sorry, I never knew. I must have walked past you 100 times. You didn't know because I didn't tell you. Can't apologize for that." The cadet nodded slowly and left with his companions. Through the doorway, Elias heard their whispered conversation fading down the hallway, fragments about respect and assumptions, and how everything felt different now. The pattern repeated throughout the day. Cadets who'd previously looked through him now looked at him, really looked with discomfort and curiosity and the beginning of understanding. Some apologized again. Others just nodded in acknowledgement, not sure what words existed for navigating this new terrain. Landon Pierce appeared during the lunch shift. Elias was emptying trash bins near the cafeteria entrance when the young man approached his usual swagger, replaced by something more tentative. "Commander Roarke," Landon's voice was quiet. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Elias tied off the trash bag, set it aside. "All right." They moved to a quieter corner. Landon looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under eyes that couldn't quite meet Elias's gaze. "I know I apologized yesterday," Landon began, "in front of everyone. But that was me trying to save face, make myself feel better." He took a shaky breath. "The truth is I was cruel to you because it was easy. You were there, you didn't fight back, and making you my target made me feel powerful. That's disgusting. That's not who I want to be." Elias waited. The boy wasn't finished. "My grandfather was career military. Made general, had all these stories about leadership and honor. He died when I was 12, and everyone told me I needed to carry on his legacy." Landon's voice cracked. "But I don't think I understood what that meant until yesterday. He wouldn't have mocked you. He would have been the first one to stand up for you. And instead, I'm the guy who made fake promotion certificates and laughed while you cleaned my deliberate messes." "You're 19, Elias said quietly. "You're allowed to be wrong at 19. The question is whether you stay wrong. I want to change. I don't know how, but I want to. Elias studied him, saw genuine remorse, but also saw the harder truth. Remorse was easy, change was hard, and wanting to be better didn't automatically translate into being better. You want to understand what leadership actually means? Elias asked. Yes, sir. Then volunteer for custodial duty, 2 hours a day for the next month. Jerry will assign you tasks. You'll clean bathrooms, empty trash, mop floors, all the work you thought was beneath you. And you'll do it while everyone who used to respect you watches you do it. Landon paled. That would be humiliating. Yes, Elias agreed. It would be. Leadership isn't comfortable. Real change isn't convenient. You can decline if you want. But if you're serious about becoming someone your grandfather would respect, this is how you start. The young man stood there, visibly warring with himself. Pride versus growth. Ego versus evolution. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. Report to Jerry tomorrow at 0600. Landon nodded and walked away, his shoulders carrying weight they hadn't before. Within a week, something remarkable happened. 3 more cadets volunteered for custodial duty, not as punishment, but as learning. Sarah Chen was one of them. She showed up in work clothes instead of her uniform, ready to mop alongside Elias without fanfare or expectation of praise. Why? Elias asked her during a shared shift cleaning the library. Because I spent 2 years walking past you without seeing you, Sarah said, scrubbing a stubborn stain. And I want to understand what that invisibility feels like. Plus, this work is harder than it looks. That deserves respect. By the 2nd week, Colonel Hammond had integrated the custodial volunteering into the Academy's leadership curriculum, not mandatory, but available for cadets who wanted practical experience in servant leadership. The waiting list grew to 20 names. Jerry was overwhelmed, but happy. Never thought I'd see the day when rich kids lined up to clean toilets, he said, reviewing the volunteer schedule. Whatever you did, Elias, it's working. It's not me, Elias corrected. It's them choosing to be uncomfortable. I'm just here with the mop bucket. The institutional changes Hammond had promised began materializing. Bystander intervention training became mandatory, led by instructors who'd undergone their own training first. The curriculum added modules on power dynamics, systemic respect, and the ethics of hierarchy. Most significantly, the Academy established an anonymous reporting system for harassment of any personnel and actually followed through with investigations and consequences. 2 cadets were expelled in the 3rd week for egregious violations that predated the symposium but had been documented and ignored. The message was clear: the new standards weren't aspirational, they were enforceable. General Denning returned a month later for a follow-up visit. He'd worked with the curriculum committee to develop a permanent leadership module titled Command Under Silence, Leading Without Applause. It was built around case studies of leaders who'd served without recognition, who'd made critical decisions in obscurity, who'd understood that real strength didn't require an audience. Elias was asked to guest lecture for the module's pilot session. He stood in front of 40 senior cadets, including Landon Pierce, who'd faithfully completed his custodial hours and requested permission to continue, and spoke about decisions made in extremity, about carrying the weight of lives saved and lives lost, about choosing service over status. But mostly he spoke about the 38 soldiers who hadn't come home from Operation Goliath. He said their names, all 38, from memory. He explained that leadership wasn't about the 212 who survived, it was about reckoning with the 38 who didn't, and carrying that mathematics in your soul while still making the next decision, and the next, because people were depending on you to function when functioning felt impossible. The classroom was silent when he finished. Not the performative silence of people waiting to react, but the profound silence of people genuinely changed by what they'd heard. Afterward, Landon approached him privately. The young man had transformed over the past month, less swagger, more substance, carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from doing hard things without applause. "I need to tell you something," Landon said. "I got my assignment for next year's summer training. I requested infantry support in a logistics capacity. Not a combat role, not something that looks impressive on paper. I asked to work supply chain in a theater where I'd be supporting soldiers in the field without ever getting credit for it." "Why?" Elias asked, though he suspected he knew. "Because I need to know if I can serve when nobody's watching. When there's no glory, no recognition, just work that matters to people who might not even know I exist." Landon met his eyes. "You taught me that leadership isn't about being seen. It's about what you do in the margins." Elias felt something in his chest, not quite pride, not quite satisfaction, but something close to hope. This boy might actually become a good officer, might actually lead people without getting them killed through ego or incompetence. "That's a good choice," Elias said. "Do the work right, and you'll understand things that most officers with twice your rank never learn." By the end of the semester, the changes at Westbridge had deepened into culture rather than remaining surface policy. Cadets began stopping in the Hall of Honor each morning, pausing at Commander Roarke's photograph, not because it was required, but because it had become a ritual, a moment to recenter before formation, to remember that rank was temporary, but character was permanent. Some whispered thank yous to the photograph. Others just stood in silence. All of them were learning something that no tactical manual could teach, that every person you encounter is carrying weight you can't see, and your choice to acknowledge or ignore that weight says everything about the leader you'll become. The Academy's Alumni Association took notice. Within 6 months, they'd established the Roarke Lecture Series, an annual event where speakers addressed humility in leadership, memory, and service, and the ethics of how we treat those we perceive as having less power. Elias attended the first lecture, but refused to sit on the stage. He watched from the back row, listening to a retired admiral speak about learning to see the people who kept ships running, the cooks, and mechanics, and supply staff whose names never made commendations, but whose work made everything else possible. After the lecture, someone sat down beside him. General Denning, in civilian clothes, looking more relaxed than he had at the symposium. "You're supposed to be on that stage," Denning said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Elias replied. They sat in comfortable silence while the audience filed out cadets discussing the lecture with genuine engagement rather than performing interest for grades. "You changed this place," Denning said finally. "You know that, right? Not with tactics or strategy or force of personality, just by being exactly who you are and letting them reckon with their own assumptions. I didn't change anything. I just stood still while they decided whether to see me." "Same thing," Denning argued. "Leadership isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about being present until presence becomes impossible to ignore." Elias considered that. "You think it'll last?" "After I'm gone, some of it will fade," Denning admitted. "That's how institutions work. But the core of it, the cadets who cleaned toilets voluntarily, the officers who changed how they see support staff, the kids who stand at your photograph every morning that's embedded now. They'll carry it to their commands. They'll teach it to their soldiers. Culture change isn't instant, but it compounds." He stood, extended his hand. "Thank you, Commander, for saving my life 22 years ago, and for saving a lot of future soldiers from bad leadership by teaching these kids what good leadership actually looks like. Elias shook his hand. "You turned out all right, General. Made good on that investment." "Trying to," Denning said. "Every day trying to." Elias continued his custodial work. He still arrived at 0400, still pushed the cart with the squeaky wheel that maintenance never quite fixed, still cleaned bathrooms and emptied trash and mopped floors with the same methodical attention he'd always applied. But now cadets said good morning. Instructors asked how he was doing. Staff members learned his full name and used it with respect that came from understanding rather than obligation. The invisibility had lifted. But not entirely. Elias still moved through the academy with quiet efficiency, still preferred the margins to the spotlight, still chose service over status in every daily decision. The difference was that now, when people looked at him, they saw him, really saw him, not just as Commander Roarke with his decorated past, but as Elias the Janitor, with his present commitment to showing up, doing the work, and treating every task with dignity, regardless of its perceived importance. Years passed. Elias aged more slowly than expected, perhaps sustained by purpose, or maybe just stubborn biology. His knees bothered him more. His back required careful management. But he kept working, kept showing up, kept being the living reminder that worth wasn't determined by rank or recognition. Cadets graduated and joined the military, carrying lessons learned from a man in coveralls who'd taught them that strength without humility fails, that respect begins before you know someone's resume, and that how you treat people when there's no benefit to treating them well defines everything about the leader you'll become. Some of those graduates sent letters back to the academy addressed to Commander Roarke. They wrote about moments in their commands when they'd remembered the lesson, when they'd stopped to see the person others overlooked, when they'd intervened to protect someone without power, when they'd chosen service over self-interest because an old janitor had shown them what real leadership looked like. Elias kept those letters in a box in his apartment. He never responded, didn't need to. But he read them sometimes on nights when the weight of 38 names felt particularly heavy. The letters reminded him that mathematics wasn't always about loss. Sometimes it was about multiplication, 212, saved becoming thousands served well by officers who'd learned to lead with humanity instead of just authority. On his 76th birthday, Jerry tried to throw him a party. Elias declined, but accepted a small cake in the maintenance break room shared among the custodial staff, who'd become his actual community over 15 years of early mornings and shared labor. "You ever regret it?" Jerry asked, cutting the cake. "Staying here when you could have done anything else?" Elias thought about it honestly. "Sometimes. But regret doesn't mean wrong. I chose this. Some days I question the choice. Most days I'm at peace with it." "That's the most Elias answer I've ever heard," Jerry laughed. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know. Something profound about service and sacrifice." "Service isn't profound," Elias said. "It's just showing up when you said you would and doing what needs doing. That's not philosophy. That's Tuesday." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Service was ordinary and profound, simultaneously mundane in its daily execution, extraordinary in its cumulative impact. He continued working until he was 78. His body finally insisted on retirement with sufficient force that stubbornness couldn't override biology. His last day was unremarkable by design. He completed his regular rounds, logged out his cart one final time, and left through the service entrance like always. Except the service entrance wasn't empty. 200 cadets stood in formation, not required, not organized by faculty, just present because they'd chosen to be. They saluted as he emerged, holding the gesture, until he returned it with hands that shook slightly, but remained precise. He didn't give a speech. didn't need to. He'd said everything that mattered over 15 years of showing up, doing the work, and being exactly who he was. He simply walked through the saluting formation, nodded once to Colonel Hammond, who stood at the edge watching with tears she didn't bother hiding, and headed for the bus stop, where Rosa waited with the number 7. "Last ride home as a working man," Rosa said as he boarded. "Just another Tuesday," Elias replied. "You really believe that?" He looked back at the academy, at the building where he'd spent 15 years being invisible, until he wasn't where he'd taught lessons about leadership that no classroom could replicate. "Yeah," he said finally, "I really do. The work was the work. Whether anyone saw it didn't change what it was." Rosa smiled and pulled into traffic. Elias died 4 years later, quietly in the same apartment with the elevator that never quite worked right. He died in his sleep, which was more mercy than many soldiers received. His funeral at Arlington was attended by 300 people. Former soldiers who'd served under him, cadets, who'd learned from him, staff who'd worked beside him, and generals who'd been shaped by his example. They buried him with full honors. 21-gun salute, flag folded with precision. General Denning delivered the eulogy, speaking about a leader who'd understood that command wasn't about the uniform you wore, but the decisions you made and the people you served, and the quiet choice to show up every day even when nobody was watching. At Westbridge, they erected a statue in the Hall of Honor, not of Commander Roarke in military dress, but of Elias the janitor with his mop and cart captured mid-stride in the act of ordinary service. The plaque read simply, "Elias Roarke, 1954 to 2036. He taught us that leadership begins with seeing respect, starts before credentials, and the truest strength is choosing service when applause is absent. Every person matters. Every moment counts. Every choice reveals who you are." Cadets still stop there every morning, continuing a ritual that began decades ago and shows no signs of ending. They pause before formation, whisper thank yous to a man who chose invisibility until visibility taught lessons no one else could, and carry forward the understanding that rank is temporary, but character is permanent, that power without compassion destroys, and that how you treat people when there's no benefit to treating them well defines everything about who you'll become and what you'll build, and whether the people you lead will trust you enough to follow, when following requires courage. The work continues. The lessons endure. And in a marble corridor washed in early light, a bronze mop rests against a cart with one wheel that never quite turned right, and a name tag that says simply Elias. Proof that the most important commanders sometimes wore coveralls, that the strongest leaders often chose margins over spotlights, and that real legacy isn't measured in medals worn, but in lives changed by someone who understood that service without recognition is still service, dignity. Without applause is still dignity. And showing up when nobody's watching is exactly when character matters most. Réessayez.